Welcome to everyone to our webinar on COVID-19 reflections and the path to recovery.
So, hello everyone, and welcome to the COVID-19 Reflections and Path to Recovery webinar, hosted by the Disaster Medicine Institute in collaboration with the Minister of Health of Jordan. My name is Wael Al-Husami. I'm a medical director at Leahy Hospital and Medical Center and a faculty member at the BI Deaconess Medical Center Fellowship Program in Disaster Medicine and an interventional cardiologist. I'm co-chairing this webinar with Dr. Greg Seaton, who is an associate professor of medicine, emergency medicine at Harvard Medical School. And also he's a director of Division of Disaster Medicine at the BI Deaconess Medical Center and the president of the World Association for Disaster Medicine, Emergency Medicine. The COVID-19 pandemic is a serious global health threat and has turned the world upside down. That has impacted how we live and interact with each other, how we work and communicate, and how we move around and travel. Every aspect of our life has been affected by this pandemic, which has caused increased fear and anxiety in people around the world. The great influenza, John Berry says, one of so many lessons of the 1918 influenza pandemic is that those who occupy positions of authority must lessen the panic that can alienate all within a society. Society cannot function if it is every man for himself. By definition, civilization cannot survive that, end quote. As healthcare providers and leaders, we must lessen the panic as we navigate through this pandemic. Today, we have distinguished speakers of various backgrounds to discuss the management and recovery from their respective expertise. And I would like to thank Amalia Boscanius, Fadi Isa, and Susan Stambeck for their great efforts in organizing this webinar. To begin, please allow me to introduce Dr. David Longworth, President of Leahy Hospital and Medical Center and Chair of BILH Primary Care Network. Beth Israel Leahy is the second largest healthcare system in the state of Massachusetts. Prior to joining Leahy, he served as a chair of Department of Infectious Disease at both Cleveland Clinic and Bay State Medical Center. Dave received his undergraduate degree from Williams College, his medical degree from Cornell University, and completed his residency in internal medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, followed by fellowship training in infectious disease in combined BI Brigham program. He has published numerous articles and book chapters relating to infectious disease. I would like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Longworth. Dave.
Well, thank you very much, Wael, for this incredible opportunity to address this group. I regret that I'm having technical difficulties with my video hookup, and so cannot be with you visually, but it's a special privilege to have an opportunity to make opening remarks today. As you have so eloquently said, we face a worldwide pandemic unlike any other that we have seen in the past century. And this pandemic challenges us as a global community which in fact has become very small in our relatedness and in the challenges we face and in the need to come together in cooperation to fight this pandemic together, to share lessons learned, to share best practices, and to, in fact, as healthcare professionals, inspire and motivate the citizens of our respective communities to do everything they can and we can in the weeks, months, and years ahead to combat this pandemic, a pandemic that has taken nearly 1.2 million lives globally, has affected nearly 46 million individuals in Jordan, has affected nearly 70,000 individuals, and a pandemic that certainly in the United States is out of control and continues to surge day over day. And so it's particularly important at this moment in time that we come together as a global community of healthcare professionals to do everything we can to fight this pandemic. So thank you for the opportunity to reflect on where we are today, as well as the challenges ahead. And with that, it is my personal privilege to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Thomas Friedman. Mr. Friedman is an internationally recognized journalist and author. Since 1995, he has been the foreign correspondent journalist to the New York Times and has been a voice of wisdom in interpreting our times in many domains: international politics, economics, energy, the climate, and certainly in recent weeks and months in our country, a voice of moral authority in terms of our democracy in the United States and the threat which it faces at this moment in time. He is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist at the New York Times, having received the Pulitzer on 3 separate occasions, and has published numerous bestsellers on the New York Times list. Mr. Friedman, I have finished my day for 25 years reading your columns at night and your books. And I wish you could see my face, because it is a special honor for me to be here today with you and to introduce you. So welcome to the webinar, Mr. Thomas Friedman.
Well, David, thank you so much. And as the parent of a Williams grad, just that little part of your bio touched home with me. And I want to thank my friend, Dr. Wael Husami, for asking me to do this. You all know that I'm not a medical doctor, but not even close. And I don't even attempt to play one on TV, but I am an expert on globalization. And I've written a lot about climate. And I'd just like to give you the kind of framework through which I've written about and covered the COVID-19 pandemic. And I want to talk about, I want to start at really 30,000 feet, really with the natural world, and then come down and talk about globalization a little bit. So whenever I talk about the pandemic, I always start by telling people that my youngest daughter, Natalie, is actually the executive producer of All Things Considered Weekend on National Public Radio, one of our big public radio shows, and she's a great little journalist, so I never miss a show. And on Easter Sunday, NPR did a roundup of pastors' sermons from churches all over America. And my favorite was Pastor Michael Curry from the National Cathedral, because he ended his Easter sermon, and this was really as the pandemic was really exploding. He ended his Easter sermon by singing a little song. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole wide world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. He's got the whole world in his hands. Now, if you just substitute she for he, she being Mother Nature, you'll understand where we are. She got the whole world in her hands. If you don't begin your analysis of this pandemic by understanding that this is a natural systems event, if that isn't the dominant framework through which you look at this phenomena, you will be off course and you will permanently stay off course. This is the first time since 1918 where all of us, all the plants and animals on the planet, are at the same time in the grip of one of Mother Nature's, let's call them fastballs, to put it in American terms, one of Mother Nature's challenges. And she throws these challenges at her plant and animal species to sort out, frankly, who is the fittest, who shall get their DNA into the next generation. And these challenges are called floods and droughts and heat waves and tornadoes and hurricanes and germs and viruses, even though viruses themselves are also just other living things looking for a warm place to call home. But when they find the wrong warm place in the wrong species, they can be, as we know, very deadly. And when Mother Nature throws these challenges at her species, who does she reward? Does she reward the smartest? No. Does she reward the strongest? No. She rewards the most adaptive. That's what Darwin taught us. She rewards the most adaptive. And so from the very beginning, this has been an adaptation challenge. Because when you're up against Mother Nature, there's always going to be a trade-off. And therefore, from the very beginning, the goal we should have assigned ourselves is how do we find the strategy that will allow us to save the maximum lives and the maximum livelihoods at the same time? Because if you just focus on saving livelihoods, you will condemn to death our neighbors and brothers and sisters who no way should be exposed to such a fate. But if you focus only on saving every life and lock down everything, you will create deaths of disease and despair that could be multiples of what COVID-19 will do. And so the strategy we needed was a rational, sane discussion from the very beginning of how do we get total harm minimization? How do we maximize saving the most lives and the most livelihoods at the same time? Well, to think about that, then you have to go back to Mother Nature and say, Mother Nature, when you say that you only reward adaptation, which adaptation strategies do you reward? What are you looking for? And if you were to ask Mother Nature that, I think what she would say is this. She says, the first question I ask about your adaptation strategy is, are you humble? Are you humble? Do you respect my virus? Because if you don't, it will hurt you or someone you love. Are you humble? Second, she asks, and David alluded to this in his introduction, are you coordinated in your response? Because I evolved my virus over millennia to find any crack in your immune system, both your individual immune system and your collective societal immune system. So are you coordinated? And lastly, she would ask, have you built your adaptation strategy on chemistry, biology, and physics exclusively? Because that's all I am, says Mother Nature. I'm just chemistry, biology, and physics. You can't talk me up. You can't talk me down. You can't say, Mother Nature, we're having a bad fall. Could you take some time off? No, she's going to do whatever chemistry, biology, and physics dictate. And to put it again in American baseball terms, Mother Nature always bats last, and she always bats 1,000. Do not mess with Mother Nature. She has not lost a duel with one of her plant and animal species in 4.8 billion years. So that to me has been the framework with which we should have looked at this from the beginning. Unfortunately, I'm not going to get into politics here, but President Trump tends not to look at the world through natural systems. He looks at it through markets. That's really his framework. His only experience with natural systems is actually building golf courses, where he actually built waterfalls. So he actually believed that he could dominate nature. So from the very beginning, he actually looked at the market. And so if the market was going up, he assumed he was winning against the virus. Of course, while the market was going up or down, Mother Nature was silently, invisibly, inexorably, exponentially, and mercilessly spreading COVID-19 throughout our society. Because she's going to do that, and the virus is going to spread until it runs out of people to host. So if we look around the world, we see three broad strategies of people trying to maximize saving lives and livelihoods. The first was the Chinese strategy. What China basically did was take all the tools of a Chinese surveillance state, facial recognition, tracking systems. They took all those tools actually designed to track their own people, and they repurposed them to trace and track a virus. And they did it with incredible efficiency. China has, according to its own statistics, less than 5,000 deaths from COVID-19. And if you don't trust those figures, double it, triple it, quadruple it, still a fraction of what we had. Now, there are various democratic versions of what China did. And you see these mostly, frankly, in Confucian societies that are very order-bound and respect top-down authority, frankly, and very hierarchical. So we see Taiwan, we see South Korea, we see Singapore, Hong Kong. they've done, these are what are called tight societies. They've done the Chinese version democratically, and to great effect, holding down the virus until they can get herd immunity through a vaccine. The second broad strategy was the Swedish strategy, basically only applied by Sweden, which was to only partially lock down their society and the economy, let the young and healthy get exposed to the virus, and hopefully build natural herd immunity through exposure and development of antibodies while protecting their most elderly. The Swedes will tell you they did a terrible job of protecting their most elderly and vulnerable. But ultimately, the judgment is still out on the Swedish experiment. The third strategy was the American strategy, which was to talk like we're going to be like China, act like we're kind of going for Sweden, herd immunity, prepare for neither, and claim to be superior to both. So we locked down haphazardly, and then we opened up haphazardly. We did not do it in a coordinated way. And instead of building our strategy on chemistry, biology, and physics, we did it on politics, ideology, and an election calendar. And we basically challenged Mother Nature to a duel. And I don't have to tell you how it's ending, with yesterday reaching a record 100,000 new coronavirus cases registered in one day. And so basically that's where we are. I would say the American strategy right now is praying for a vaccine, because it's very clear that we are incapable of, as a society in total, of respecting the virus, incapable of organizing ourselves in a coordinated fashion, because the virus actually doesn't know where the border is between Oklahoma and Texas. And it's obvious that we are not building a national strategy on chemistry, biology, and physics. We put mass and opening in opposition to each other. We made it mass or restaurants, mass or schools, mass or baseball games, when it should have been mass for opening, mask for school, mask for restaurants, mask for baseball. So really, I think you're going to see the virus go parabolic here, frankly. And I think we just have to pray for a vaccine as soon as possible. So much for the virus per se. Let me then, because this is such an international audience, just take a last few minutes to talk to you about what does all this say about globalization? How to think about this virus in the context of globalization? Well, you know, I started looking around as the virus began about 9 months ago, and I looked around at what I had been writing. I've been the foreign affairs columnist for the New York Times since 1995. And I started to look around and I realized that I'd actually been covering pandemics for the last 25 years. Well, how is that? Why is it we seem to have a pandemic of a different kind every 7-8 years? We had a geopolitical pandemic called 9/11 on 2001. We had a financial pandemic called the Great Recession in 2008. We had a biological pandemic called COVID-19 in 2019, and we're in the midst of an atmospheric pandemic called climate change. Why is it we're having pandemics once every 4 years? And actually, if you look at these pandemics, what you'll notice is each one began with a warning heart attack and then the full coronary. So in 1993, a guy named Ramzi Youssef tried to blow up the World Trade Center. Fortunately, the bomb didn't go off sufficiently, and a few people were killed relatively, and many thousands injured. That was the warning heart attack. And in 9/11, Osama bin Laden delivered a political pathogen that induced the full heart attack. In 1998, a hedge fund on Wall Street called Long-Term Capital Management, you may remember that name, managed to amass $1 trillion in leverage. They almost melted down all of Wall Street. But fortunately, quick and coordinated action by the Federal Reserves and a group of Wall Street banks contained the damage from long-term capital management. That was the warning heart attack. And in 2008, we got the full coronary. In 2002, a coronavirus appeared in Guangzhou, China. It was called SARS-CoV-1. A doctor from Guangzhou traveled to Hong Kong, stayed in a hotel, stayed in room 911, in fact, can't make that up, And SARS broke out of China, but fortunately through coordinated action, we were able to limit its impact. That was the warning heart attack. And in 2019, we got the full coronary. And right now, every day, through wildfires in California, through record hurricanes, we are getting the warning heart attacks for climate change. And beware with climate change, because unlike a coronavirus, climate change doesn't peak. Once you melt the Arctic ice cap, the sun's rays will just hit the water directly and boil the ocean forever. You will live with the impact forever. There's also no herd immunity to climate change. There's only an endless pounding on the herd. So why all these pandemics? Why are we seeing geopolitical, financial, biological, and atmospheric pandemics that are shaking the whole world? Well, it's because what we've done through globalization. You know, I wrote a book back in 2005 called The World is Flat. And people often ask me, hey, Friedman, is the world still flat? Oh, baby, it is flatter than ever. What's happened over the last 20 years is we've connected more nodes on the global system farther, faster, deeper, cheaper than ever before. And we've connected and greased the connection between those nodes to make it faster than ever. So between December 2019 and March 2020, there were 3,200 direct flights from China to the United States. 3,200 direct flights just between December 2019 and March 2020. There were 50 direct flights between Wuhan, China, and the United States. How many Americans had ever heard of Wuhan? Who knew that there were 50 direct flights from Wuhan to America? So we've connected more nodes and we've greased the connections between those nodes. Then what we did was we started taking all the buffers out between those nodes, the buffers that were either natural, cultural, or physical, to manage the flow between the nodes and prevent surges. We started to systematically take the buffers out. So in geopolitics, you know, cultural diversity is a buffer. What did Osama bin Laden want to do? He wanted to purge the Arab Muslim world. He wanted to purge it of all non-Muslim influences. Well, the Arab Muslim world has been at its height and glory and most powerful when it was the most diverse, culturally diverse civilization on the planet, as in Moorish Spain. And when you purge diversity in both politics or nature, what happens? Well, monocultures in nature are enormously susceptible to disease compared to polycultures, because one disease can wipe right through a monoculture. And it's also true in politics. In politics, one diseased idea can rip through a political monoculture. In nature, we did the same thing, and that's what gave us SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2. Where did they come from? Well, China rapidly urbanized its cities, grew into wilderness areas, destroyed a lot of these wilderness areas, and killed the apex predators in all of these ecosystems. They killed the apex predators and they left behind only the generalized species of bats, rats, and primates, species that could live actually in damaged or destroyed ecosystems. Then what they did was go and hunt them. And these bats, rats, and primates evolved in the wilderness with their coronaviruses. They evolved over millennia with them. But when you remove them from these wilderness areas and bring them into a wet market in Guangzhou or Wuhan, where they can bite another mammal or be eaten by another mammal or be eaten by a human, suddenly that coronavirus that evolved in the wilderness gets zoonotically transferred to human beings who have not evolved with this virus at all, and we see the effects. In finance, what did we do? We took out the buffers of transparency and limits on leverage. So when long-term capital management amassed $1 trillion in leverage, it was because there was no transparency. Every bank knew what they had lent long-term capital management, but no one had a picture of the total. And so without that transparency, the buffer of transparency, they were able to amass much more leverage than any single hedge fund should do. And of course, that was just done 1,000 times more during 2008. And of course, with climate change, we're removing the buffer, both natural buffers like mangroves that buffer hurricanes, and of course the buffer of CO2 and forest coverage. So what you see, and this is the reason all of you doctors are going to be so busy, because basically we are globalizing the world, connecting more and more nodes, greasing the connection between those nodes, and then we're pulling out the buffers that were there naturally or wisely installed by humans to actually manage the flow between these nodes. And that's why one of the biggest issues we all have to come to terms with after this over, to study that lesson, that if we're going to continue to globalize the world, and there are many benefits of that, we need to be thinking about what are the natural, political, climactic buffers we need to keep in place to manage the flow of this system so we get the best out of it and cushion the worst. Thank you very much. Have a great conference. David, Wael, thank you very much for letting me talk for a few minutes to your audience.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Friedman. As always, your wisdom is such a gift in helping us to understand the times in which we live. Before we move on to the next speaker, I would ask you one question.
Please.
And that question is, you have a large audience of healthcare professionals in this webinar from around the world. What advice do you have for us?
You know, in my experience, David, in talking to different doctors and healthcare professionals, you know, my only advice is and there's just been so much heroic, you know, so many people running into the fire, which is what so many healthcare professionals have done. They didn't run away from the fire; they ran into the fire, ran into the emergency wards, and against a highly infectious disease. So my hat is off to them. But you know, one of the reasons we and I'm going to say something unfair because I'm asking you to do something that you're really not trained to do. It's really the role of politicians. But the reason our conversation in America got so off track is we made the debate lives versus livelihoods. We made it lives versus livelihoods. And we had to have a rational debate about how to balance and maximize saving lives and livelihoods. And that's not the job of doctors. Your job is to save lives. The job of framing it right is the job of politicians and leaders. But because we made lives and livelihoods enemies, we could never actually get a coordinated response. We could never get the strategy we needed, which was total harm minimization. And then unfortunately, all of this happened in the middle. We had a pandemic and we had an infodemic at the same time because we had an internet that allowed, you know, all kinds of crazy things to spread. We had cable news that would take, you know, one case. We just had such a numerator problem because everyone would tell you about this one case here, this one case there, and you never knew, was that 1 out of 2? Was it 1 out of 100? Was it 1 out of 100,000? Was it 1 out of 1 million? And so it became so difficult for the average person, you know, to think through how do we measure different policies? Because if you don't know what the denominator is in these stories, if you just hear that a 5-year-old, you know, died of coronavirus and you have no idea whether that's, again, 1 out of 1 million or 1 out of 5, it became really paralyzing for the public. So I think to the extent that medical professionals can, and my experience is the vast majority have been, you know, contribute to a balanced discussion of this. And again, it's not really your job, it's my job. It's a job of our political leaders. But in doing that, I think you're doing the Lord's work.
Well, thank you very much for your comments this morning and for your time. We are very grateful.
Really appreciate it.
It's my privilege. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks.
It's my privilege to introduce our next speaker, His Excellency Dr. Nathir Obadat. Dr. Obadat is the Minister of Health of Jordan and a professor of medicine at the University of Jordan. Dr. Obadat has had an incredibly distinguished career, having served as chair of the Department of Medicine and Respiratory and Sleep Medicine at the University of Jordan School of Medicine, as well as Dean of the Jordan University School of Medicine. He is a recognized authority in the field of pulmonary and critical care medicine and is widely published in this area. So good morning, Dr. Obadat. Thank you for being with us this morning and for the opportunity to introduce you.
Thank you, Dr. David, for the introduction, and I would like to thank Mr. Friedman for his excellent talk. It's very nice always to hear from distinguished speaker, and especially when they are talking about medical problems and they are not doctors. It's very nice.